All right, good morning. I am actually reteaching this class, so this is just for you online. Last night I taught the week 3 of the deeper class, and unfortunately I forgot to hit the record button. So I'm going to do this again so that we can have this online. So there's not actually anyone in the room with me, but I'm just doing this for your benefit, so I hope that you enjoy. Some of the things won't quite translate well to the online space, but we'll do our best as we move forward. So let's dig right in, shall we? We're talking about context this week. Really quick, let's do a recap of the last couple weeks. Let me advance this here. So last couple of weeks we talked about what is the Bible, and we talked about that the Bible is inspired. 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 says that the Bible is inspired or breathed out by God, that God takes a little bit of himself and puts it into Scripture. And so it is unique, it is durable, it has withstood the test of time, and its meaning remains clear. It is consistent despite the fact that it was written over thousands of years. It does not contradict itself. We also talked about the whole story of the Bible. This was last week, and we talked about that the Bible is really a story of redemption. The Bible is really a story of redemption, and that Jesus is the most important part. Jesus is the center point of the Bible. Everything in the Bible is either leading up to Jesus or coming away from Jesus and clarifying what he said and clarifying what his life and his death and his resurrection means to us. All right, so that's what we talked about the last couple of weeks. You can find both of those online on our YouTube page, as you probably are right now. So let's move forward into context. I am most excited about this context piece in all of the all the 4 classes. The context piece is one of my favorites because I think one of the most difficult parts of reading Scripture is understanding the context. I think that is by far the most difficult part of understanding Scripture. So what is context? Context is the surrounding circumstances of a particular word, passage, or train of thought. So if you're looking at a verse you do not understand, the context is in part the verse before and after, the section in which it is found, perhaps the larger set, perhaps the whole chapter or the whole book in which it is found. It may be even a collection of books. And then it's also the world behind the text, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. All right, so why context? All right, context matters because hopefully you can see up on the screen, but I'll read it for you if you're not able to. So Luke 4:7 says, "If you worship me, it will all be yours." I could take this verse out of context. You don't know what comes before it. You don't know what comes out after it unless you pause this video and go look it up. But don't do that. It'll spoil it, all right? So if you worship me, it will all be yours. It's implied that this is God saying if you'll worship God, everything on earth will be yours if you just ask him. So let's give it some more context. I will give you, so this is 4b through 7. I will give you all the kingdom's authority and splendor. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours. Again, I could take that same passage and twist it to make it sound like God is saying, if you worship me, I'm going to give you all this stuff. But that's not actually what it says. Let's read the whole 2 verses. "And the devil said to Jesus, I will give you all the kingdom's authority and splendor. It has all been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours." It was actually Satan saying this. It was when he was tempting Jesus. And so context is incredibly important. Context in general is how we interpret the Bible. It's how we interpret the Bible. You do this automatically. If you've been reading the Bible for a while, or even when you're reading other books, you automatically look to context. And so some of these things that we're going to be talking about are incredibly basic. And that's okay. We're laying a foundation here. All right, context is also incredibly helpful when you run into a passage you do not understand. All right, this can unlock the meaning behind a certain passage. All right. And then context is meant to enhance, not complicate daily Bible reading, right? I have said it before that you should be reading your Bible on a daily basis. And this is not meant to take 15, 20 minutes of Bible reading and turn it into a mandatory 2 hours every morning. All right, this is meant to enhance your Bible. When you stumble across something you don't understand, when you stumble across something that just isn't speaking to you or confuses you or puzzles you or whatever, this is a way to unlock the meaning of the passage. Context can be incredibly helpful in that way. All right, so let's go over some terminology. Now, I don't want you to memorize these words. They are important words, I think, but the words themselves are not the important part. It's the concepts that I want you to remember. All right, so the first one is exegesis, which is an effort to reach back in time to understand what this would have meant to the original author and the original audience. All right, so exegesis is all about going back in time to understand the original author and the original audience. For example, in the book of Ruth, there's a story about a woman named Ruth who's a widow, and she goes with her mother-in-law to back to Israel and meets this man named Boaz and decides that she's going to court him. And one of the things that she does is she takes the sandals off of his feet and places them next to his head. And then she sits at his feet until he wakes up. All right, now if you did that to me, I would be weirded out. Significantly weirded out, because that's a very odd thing. But culturally, that was significant to them. And so context is going, okay, when the people who were around at this time, when they read this, what did it mean to them? Because that was a show of respect. It was a sign of respect. It was a gentle way to say, hey, I have something I'd like to tell you. All right, so context or exegesis is going back in time to figure out what this meant to them. It's digging into, exegesis literally means like digging in and pulling out the information. All right, then we have hermeneutics. Again, the word is not important, it's the concept. Hermeneutics is an effort to derive contemporary relevance from ancient texts. Let me put that in normal speak. All right, hermeneutics is the second step to exegesis. Exegesis is about going back in time and saying, what did this mean to them? All right, so we could go back in time and figure out what did this mean to them, and that would be all great and that would be all dandy, but how do we apply it to our lives today in the 21st century? That's what hermeneutics is about. Hermeneutics is about bridging the gap, and it's trying to say, okay, the Bible said this to them, what is it saying to me today? Again, we are automatically doing these things when we're reading the Bible well, but this is what's going on when we are reading the Bible. We're trying to bridge the gap and trying to say, what is the Bible speaking to me today? Because the Bible, because it is inspired, because it is timeless and durable, has things that it wants to say to us today. But some of those things may take some translation culturally, because we're not living in the time of the Galatians. We're not living in the first century or 1500 BC when Moses was writing the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So it may take some translation. All right? Now, this next word, if you printed out the blanks and are looking at them, this next blank says bad with an exclamation mark. It is eisegesis. Eisegesis. And eisegesis is a naughty word if you were on a Christian campus, Bible campus or something like that. All right, eisegesis is the opposite of exegesis. All right, exegesis is going to the text and saying, what does the text say? And what can I pull out of the text? All right, eisegesis is, what do I want the text to say? What can I put into the text to make it say what I want it to say? Let me give you an example of this. All right, in Matthew 25, there is a parable called the parable of the talents. All right, and you could even pause this video and go look at it, but I'll summarize it really quickly. There is a rich man who has 3 servants. He gives the first one 1 talent, the second one 2 talents, the third one 5 talents, because he's going away for a while. All right, so he goes away. The one who had 5 talents turns it into 10 talents. He works hard and doubles the amount that he was given. The one who had 2 talents does the same. He takes what he has, doubles it, turns it into 4. The one who had 1 buries it in the ground. The man returns, sees that one man turned 5 into 10 and congratulates him and rewards him. Sees that one man turned 2 into 4 and rewards him as well. But the man who had 1 talent he punished, because he didn't take what he had and used it. He buried it in the ground and basically forgot about it, and says if you'd put it in a bank, you could have even gotten a little bit of interest on this. All right? Now, in the original context, in the original Greek that Matthew was written in, talent could mean one thing and one thing alone. A talent was a weight measurement of money. All right? So in the context of the parable, now a parable is a metaphor. And so this parable was it was an earthly example meant to explain heavenly truths. All right? So the metaphor goes on to other arenas, but within the context of the parable, the only possible interpretation of the word talents, if we look back at what did this mean to the original audience, could have been that a talent is a weight of money. All right, now fast forward to the 1960s. In the 60s, there was a big movement made popular by just pastors and different theologians, not from any particular denomination or tradition. But there was a real popular movement where people noticed that, okay, so that talent to them meant a weight of money. But we have a word called talent. We have a word called talent, and our talent means like an inborn ability, like that person is very talented at music, or that person is very talented at public speaking, or that person is very talented at sports. And so they said, what if this isn't just about a talent as in a weight of money, but within the confines of the parable, what if it was about a talent as an inborn ability? This rich man gave one man 5 inborn abilities, and he turned it into 10, and one he gave 2, and he turned that into 4, and one he gave 1, and that man didn't use his inborn ability. All right, that is eisegesis. That is us taking an English word that would have been unknown to Jesus, the speaker, would have been unknown to Matthew, the author, would have been unknown to both the original audience to which Jesus spoke and the original audience to which Matthew wrote. That word talent would have been completely unknown to them, and they wouldn't have interpreted it that way. That is our English that we are reading into the text. Okay? And we do that in a number of areas. That's just a very obvious example that I have. We do that in a lot of places where we read our own meaning into the text. And that's eisegesis, and we don't want to do that. Okay? So when we want to do some exegesis, when we want to figure out context, we ask basic questions. Who, what, when, where, why? Right? These are quite good journalistic questions. Anytime you're reading a book and you want to know what's going on, or you're watching a movie and you want to know what's going on, these are the questions you are subconsciously asking to try and understand, to bring context to what you're reading or what you're watching. All right? Now, I want to pause here and answer the question, where do I find all this stuff? We're going to be talking about a lot of different things. Now, this is where the you're not sitting here, you're on the internet is going to break down just a little bit because I've got some resources here that I'll kind of hold up, but I'm pretty far away and I'm a little dark where I'm at, you know. But anyway, we'll make it work. So, where do I find all this stuff? All right, some of this stuff we find in a regular Bible. All right, I've got over here, I've got a regular Bible. All right, this is the Bible I read from often on a daily basis. If you can kind of see it, it's just a normal Bible. You're not missing out on much. Now, if you have a Bible with you and you were to open it up, you'll see you'll see a couple things. First of all, you'll see numbers. Right? Like right now, I'm in Isaiah chapter 49, and I can see a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So if I told you to open to Isaiah 49:8, you would know exactly where I'm pointing you to. Now, those numbers weren't originally in the Bible when Isaiah wrote it, right? He just wrote a body of text. The numbers were added hundreds of years later. All right? But they're a helpful addition because you don't have to say, okay, turn to Isaiah paragraph 470. You can say turn to verse, chapter 48, verse 8, right? Also, you'll notice some section headings. So I'm at Isaiah 49, and it says, above the text, the Lord's servant commissioned. All right, it's a sneak peek on what is about to be in this section. And that section lasts until verse 7. And then in verse 8, it has a new section heading. It says, Promises of Israel's Restoration. And that lasts all the way through 50, verse 3. All right. Now, again, those section headings were not originally written by Isaiah. They were wrote by translators who added them for our benefit. They give us a sneak peek on, hey, here's where the section starts, and here's where the next section starts, and that previous section ends. All right. So when we talk about literary context in a minute, you're going to see some of this in a regular Bible. All right. You can also get something called a reference Bible, which will have a little section in the middle that gives you some additional verses. So, for example, the story of Jesus' death is found in all 4 of the Gospels. All right. It's found in all 4 of the Gospels. So if you're reading it in the Gospel of Matthew, then you might see in the little middle section some references to Mark, Luke, and John, where it is directing you to the same story in those Gospels. Or there's a lot of places in the New Testament where they're quoting the Old Testament. And you'll see a little reference where it says, hey, if you want to know more about that quote, if you want to get some context for that quote, go back and read it back here in Isaiah or back here in Ezekiel or wherever that quote came from. All right? So, where else do we find all this stuff? You may find it from a study Bible. A study Bible. All right, so I'm going to describe this study Bible to you, but if you don't, you're not going to be able to see it from where the camera is at. But I'm just going to describe this study Bible. Okay, so if I open this study Bible to the very beginning of Luke, this is an ESV, English Standard Version. We'll talk more about translations next week. This is an English Standard Version study Bible. All right, so I open up to Luke, and it doesn't launch us right into the biblical text. It first gives us an introduction to the gospel according to Luke. So it tells me a little bit about the author. It tells me a little bit about the date that this book was likely written. It tells me about some themes that are found in the book. It tells me about a timeline of how the book goes. It tells me about the purpose and occasion and background. It tells me the history of salvation summary. It tells me some literary features and key themes. There's a lot of stuff going on, and then it gives me an outline. It gives me an outline. So it says the first section is like chapter 1 through partway through chapter 2. And the second section is chapter 3 through 4. The next section is 4 through 9. All right, and then it's got like subsections and subpoints, so you can kind of see where all the pieces fit together and kind of the flow of thought. All right? And then when I get to the actual Bible itself, it has so up above it has the biblical text, but down below it has notes. So if you run across something confusing, it's like you've got an expert sitting next to you who's explaining what is going on down below. In terms of, he's saying, hey, this is going on up in the biblical text, and he's going to explain it down below. All right, so a study Bible can be maybe that's not new to you. You've been using a study Bible for a while. But a study Bible can be incredibly helpful. All right. Now, I have a few study Bible recommendations. My personal favorite, especially if you are new to a study Bible, is the NLT, New Living Translation, Life Application Study Bible. Life Application Study Bible. All right, and here's why I like this particular Bible. It is very application focused. It's all about, okay, here's a neat historical tidbit, but here's how you apply this verse or this text or this chapter to your life. It's very application focused. Then there's the ESV Study Bible by Crossway. It's a great study Bible. I have a copy that I use for most of my personal devotional time. It is a little more historically based, so it's got a lot more historical tidbits, a little less application heavy, but it's got a lot of great stuff in it. And I've also heard great things about the NIV Study Bible. Don't own one personally, but I've heard good things about that as well. All right, let's go one level deeper. We have commentaries. All right, a commentary is a commentary. So I'm going to hold up a couple things here. So here is a normal, I don't know if you can see this. Here's a normal Bible. Here's a commentary. It's a lot thicker. All right, and a commentary doesn't even include the biblical text. It is pure notes. It is pure other people's thoughts on the biblical text. All right, it's not the biblical text itself. It's someone else's thoughts, someone else's notes, someone else's commentary on the Bible. All right, and I've included two commentaries on the notes. The first one is the Life Application New Testament Commentary. This comes from the same people as the Life Application Study Bible, only it's just the New Testament, and it's a lot more notes and a lot more application. So that might be helpful. And then also, if you want to, so this would be about as deep as you have to go into the rabbit hole for now, the Bible Knowledge Commentary. There's an Old Testament and a New Testament edition or volume. So it's a 2-volume set, and it really digs into some of the historical, cultural, different things going on. All right, now there are lots of other commentaries out there. Rob has I'm trying to think, it's some kind of NIV commentary that is multi-volume. We're talking 40, 50, 60 volumes. So fairly expensive. My personal favorite is the Word commentary. I don't own any of them right now, but someday I hope to own some of them at least. They are almost excruciating in their detail. And that's probably 80 or so volumes for that one. So you don't have to go out and spend all that money on that. Step 1 would be make sure you have a regular Bible. Step 2 would be get a study Bible. A study Bible can be so incredibly helpful, especially if you struggle to understand the Bible, because it's like having an expert sitting next to you explaining some things. All right. And then if you have a study Bible and you're like, you know what, I want that little extra push of depth, you might try a commentary. All of these that I've been talking about are usually about $30 to $50 on Amazon per volume. So like the 2-volume set's going to be a little more, maybe $60 to $80 if I remember correctly. But you can take a look at all those. All right, so let's dive back into context now that we've talked about some of the resources available to us. All right, so first thing, there are two kinds of context. The first one is the first one is cultural historical context. Cultural historical context. So we're going to talk about what that means in a minute, but that is looking at the world behind the text. All right, looking at the world behind the text. The second one is literary context, and that is looking at the text itself. All right, and so we're going to dive into both of these. Let's dive into cultural historical context first. All right, these are the kinds of questions you ask. First off, who is the author? All right, you can find that. Now, if you go back to week 2, on YouTube, and in the description for the video, you click on the notes. I have included in the notes of that a fairly exhaustive resource attached to the third or fourth or fifth page of the notes, I think, that gives you all the books of the Bible and a variety of information. And among that is the author of each book of the Bible. Some books we know, some books we don't know. All right, so you could go to the book of Galatians in a study Bible or in a commentary or even check online, and you could ask the question, who wrote the book of Galatians? And pretty much there's some books that scholars kind of disagree, and it says it's Paul, but they're not really sure based on the grammar. Galatians, everybody's confident it was written by Paul. Like everybody's pretty sure that it was written by Paul. So if I really want to dig into Galatians and get into the brain of the author, I'm going to read about Paul. I'm going to read about his story as it's found in Acts, where he was named Saul, and he was a Pharisee and persecuted Christians and put them to death. Personally oversaw this, and he was on his way to do some more of that when he came across this guy, he came across this vision, and this guy named Jesus spoke to him, and he eventually converted and became a Christian. Right? And so you can read about Paul and kind of get into his head a little bit. And also in Galatians, knowing a little bit about the author, you can, he tells a little bit of a story, I think it's in Galatians 2, where he confronted Peter. And that's actually a story that lines up with another story or a similar story in Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council, and where Paul was a part of that, and when they were trying to figure out what to do with all these Gentiles. So you can kind of see a little bit of that, and you can see how knowing the author will help you get into their brain a little bit and see what they were thinking when they were writing it. All right, the next thing you do is you look at the audience. Now again, if you look in those notes from last week, I included for the entire New Testament who the original audience was. All right, because sometimes it's really obvious. So the Galatians, the book of Galatians, the original audience were the Galatians. People living in a region called Galatia. All right? The Ephesians, the book of Ephesians, was written to Ephesians. They were a people living in a city called Ephesus. All right? So not a region, but a city. All right? But then 1st and 2nd Peter were written by Peter. 1st, 2nd, 3rd John written by John. But 1st and 2nd Corinthians were written to the Corinthians living in a place called Corinth. All right, so knowing the audience can be helpful because sometimes it was written by a person and named after that person. Sometimes it was written to a person or to a people and it was named after that person or those people. All right, so that can be a helpful resource. And it can be helpful to know about the audience. And this goes into the setting as well. Let me give an example of both audience and setting coming together. All right. The book of Ephesians was written to a group of people called Ephesians in a town called Ephesus in the first century world. And Ephesus was a port town known for its large temple to a particular goddess, and this temple was full of prostitutes. All right, it was a significant part of their regional commerce was this temple full of prostitutes. All right, and so the author of Ephesians writes, which you can look up online or in a study Bible or in a commentary, writes to this church in part about that. And so knowing what is going on in their world can bring a lot of clarity. Right, 1st and 2nd Peter talk about persecution. He talks about persecution in his books. And if you know the original audience, you know that persecution was a real concrete concern in their day-to-day lives. Persecution isn't something we experience today, at least not like they did. Right? It's more of an abstract concept to us. But for them, it was a real, concrete, everyday problem that they were dealing with. All right? And so when we get into the mind of the audience, we can empathize with them a little bit better. Things become a little more concrete. And I think it lends some understanding before we even start trying to bridge the gap. Right? When we're just trying to understand how they would have read it. So that's a little bit of cultural, historical background. You can use some different tools to figure this stuff out. You can use study Bibles and commentaries and even biblical history books, right? You want to learn a little bit more about the Galatians in the first century. There are books written, history books written on particular regions or towns in the Bible describing what life was like for those individuals. So you can check those out as well. All right, let's move on to literary context. All right, literary context is split into broader and immediate literary context. Broader and immediate literary context. All right, now the thing about literary context is, for the most part, this doesn't require a study Bible. It doesn't require a commentary. You can get away with a regular Bible for almost all of this. However, because we don't all have PhDs in literature, we're going to miss out on some of these things. All right, so that's why a study Bible or a commentary can be helpful in identifying some of these things. Let's talk about broader literary context. Where does this passage fall in the whole story of the Bible? Where does it fall in the whole story of the Bible? A place where this can be incredibly helpful is, in particular, we talked last week about the prophets, the major and the minor prophets. and how sometimes they're speaking to very specific individuals in a manner called an oracle, where they're calling out a specific king for what they're doing. Last week, I think I talked about King Jehoiakim. And he was doing some stuff, and there was doom coming to him. But we don't really know why there was doom coming to him. Now, that same story takes place at the same time as parts of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. There's a lot of overlap between those 4 books and all the prophets. A lot of these things are happening simultaneously. And so that a prophet might be speaking specifically against a particular king who you can read about in 1st and 2nd Kings. All right? And so you can look at the broader story and see, where does this fit in? You also compare it to, where are we at in relation to Jesus? Are we pre-Jesus? Are we during Jesus' lifetime? Or are we after Jesus? Because that's going to change how we read the text. All right? Also, we look at the individual books and letters. We look at the purpose of a particular book, or of the purpose of a particular letter in the New Testament. So, for example, last week again, I talked about Matthew, the Gospel according to Matthew, being primarily written to a Jewish audience. It was a treatise, really, on how Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. It was almost like a mathematical proof. He said, okay, we have all of these prophecies about the Jewish Messiah. Here's how Jesus fulfilled all those prophecies about the Jewish Messiah. Therefore, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. All right? Now, one of the prophecies they knew was that Jesus would, or the Messiah, whoever that was, would come from the line of David. And so Matthew begins his book with a long genealogy, saying this person was the son of this person, was the son of this person, and it shows that Jesus came from the line of David. Jesus came from the line of David. All right, if you read that, you might be asking, why in the world is this important information? Well, it ties into the purpose of the book, which was to really to logic, or use logic to speak to Jewish believers or Jewish non-believers at the time. All right. You can also look at different themes of a particular book or a particular letter. If you looked at the book of Ecclesiastes is an incredibly depressing book if you don't read it in the right context, right? Because you look at the book of Ecclesiastes and it's this guy who's just complaining about everything, and he's saying everything is meaningless. Or in an older translation, vanity of vanities. He's like, I tried going out with all kinds of women and that was meaningless. I didn't find happiness there. I had all the wealth of the world and I couldn't find happiness there. I had all the knowledge and wisdom that the world had to offer, and that too was meaningless. I did everything this world had to offer, and it was all meaningless. However, when you look at the themes of the book, you realize that all this theme of meaningless is drawing you to the reality that true happiness is only found in God. And so he's basically detailing, hey, these are the ways you don't try and pursue happiness, because I tried it and I didn't find it there. All right? That's a recurring theme in that book. And so you might get lost in all the meaningless, but if you understand that that is a theme throughout the book and that it's leading you somewhere, it lends meaning to that particular theme. All right, we've got broader literary context. That is the book, the collection of books, the whole Bible. Let's bring it down into the immediate literary context. Immediate literary context. You have things like the genre. All right, there are a number of genres. All right, I've got them up here. I've got them in the notes. Also, if you go and look at that document from last week, genre is one of the things I have for each book of the Bible. I tell you what the genre is. Now, some books have more than one genre. All right, for example, Exodus is mostly historical narrative. It's a story about the Israelites being in slavery and Moses leading them out of slavery and crossing the Red Sea and all that kind of stuff. But then the second half is a lot of Moses telling the law. It's, hey, here's a bunch of rules God has for you. And we read different genres differently. All right, let me give you an example. We read the Gospels almost like historical narratives. They are biographies. They are factual. All right. So Jesus, in many of the Gospels, there's a story that he feeds 3,000 people and 5,000 people in another story with some fish and some bread. Handful of fish, handful of bread. All right. He feeds thousands of people with barely enough food for a couple people. It's a miracle, right? And because of the genre, because it is a historical narrative, because it is a gospel, a biography, we know that those aren't exaggerations, those aren't figures of speech. He literally fed thousands of people with a handful of food. It was an amazing miracle that we can barely understand. But we know this because of the genre that this particular writing was. Now, compare that to Song of Songs. Song of Songs is a big poem, a big song, right? It's got poetic, flowery language, and in it there are two lovers who are talking back and forth to one another. All right, one of them is a man describing this perfect woman. All right, and he uses lots of poetic, flowery language that you take figuratively. Because here's what would happen. I don't know if you're going to be able to see this. Here's what would happen if you took it literally. All right, you'd get this freakish, horrific-looking woman who's got the head of goats and a nose like rock and a neck like a tall tower. Right? You've got this weird-looking, it's not meant to be taken literally, it's meant to be taken figuratively, and you know this because it's a poem. Whereas the Gospels are narrative. They are meant to be taken literally. Does that make sense? All right. Moving on. So you look at the genre, got to change my notes here. You also look at the surrounding text. All right, this is where those headings that I was talking about, the section headings, can come in very handy. You look at different section headings, right? What is all in that same section heading? What is an adjacent section heading? Where is this in the flow of thought? The overall flow of thought. So for example, let me give you a couple examples. Matthew 13 is the parable of the farmer scattering seed, and also the parable of the wheat and the weeds, or the wheat and the tares in other translations. All right? But now, if you read these two parables and you're like, I have no idea what these parables are about, I have good news for you. Immediately following both in chapter 13, those parables are explanations of what the parables mean. Jesus says very bluntly, the farmer represents this, the wheat represents this, the tares represent this. That's what this story is about. And so in this example, the surrounding text brings clarity to the text itself, right? If you read a little bit farther, you'll understand what it is that you are reading. All right. We also look for repeated words or phrases. For example, in Luke 15, we get the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the lost son, or the prodigal son. And if you read one story and you're like, I'm not really sure what this is about, read the second story and the third story, because they're all trying to drive home the same point. And they keep hitting the same kinds of things. They keep using the same kinds of words. You could look at times where Jesus says, truly, truly, or verily, verily in older translations. See, especially in ancient texts, if you wanted to emphasize a word, so in English we would say, if something was good, but it was like more than that, we would say it's very good. But in the original text you would say it is good, good. When you use the same word twice in a row, it emphasizes that word. And so if you see Jesus say, truly, truly, he's saying, like, guys, this isn't just true. This is really true. This is very true. All right? Also, the vanity of vanities, meaningless, 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 in Ecclesiastes. If you keep seeing a word over and over and over and over, you should probably figure out why it's there. All right? So you look for repeated words or phrases. You also look for transition words or phrases. Things like, and then, therefore, above all. Therefore is one of my favorite because it's got this nice little quip to it. If you see a therefore, figure out what it's there for. All right? Therefore is a transition word that says, in light of A, B. right? In light of what comes before this. All right? And so it's like a cause and effect kind of a thing. Or and then shows sequential. So this happened and then this happened. So if you're you're confused in the first part, you might want to go back to or in the second part. If you're confused in the second part, you might want to go back to the first part so that you can better understand the second part, because the second part is predicated on the first part. Or you can look at above all, right? Above all draws your attention to, hey, if you weren't paying attention to the first part, well, really pay attention to this, because, all these things are great, but above all, focus in on this right here. All right? So, and then we look for words that are unclear or puzzling or difficult. Words that are unclear, puzzling, or difficult. An example of this would be the word chaff. I was in a small group where we were talking about this, and someone wasn't sure about the word chaff and what it meant. All right, and so we looked it up. And we were in Psalm 1:4, where it says, the wicked are like chaff. They're blown away with the wind. And you got to know what chaff is. And now I grew up on a farm, so I knew what chaff was. All right, chaff is you pick the grain of wheat off of a head of wheat, but it's got this like a little bit of a skin on it that protects the grain itself. And so what you do is you can rub it between your hands a couple times, and the skin will kind of come loose from the grain. And you can blow on it, and the skin will blow away. That skin is called the chaff. It's the part of the head of wheat that you don't actually want, but it protects the seed. All right, and so you get rid of it so you can get to the seed. And it's very light, and it blows away very easily. And so these are first century or earlier than first century people. They would have understood the concept and the idea of chaff. It wouldn't have been some abstract thing to them. It would have been like, oh yeah, I was working with chaff yesterday. I understand that very well. All right, so we look for words that are unclear or puzzling or difficult, because sometimes there's a lot of meaning that can be unlocked in those. And then along with that, the best tools for both immediate and broader literary context. Again, a lot of this can be found in a regular Bible. But a study Bible or a commentary can help you see where the flow of thought is, see an outline, see where it falls in the context. It may draw your attention to, hey, this story also happens in Matthew, and there's some additional notes over there if you'd like to check it out. All right? All right, so I've got just a few additional resources here. Most of these I've already talked about. Two I want to bring your attention to. How to Read Your Bible for All It's Worth by Fee and Stewart is a great resource. Definitely a book worth buying. It especially talks about the genres and how to read different genres, because you read law differently than you read the prophets, differently than you read the Gospels. All right, and then a brief guide to biblical interpretation. This is actually written by a professor that I had in seminary. Incredibly intelligent guy, very, very simplified book. Very short, actually. It's a very, very short book, but very helpful in unpacking what exegesis is, how it's different from hermeneutics, some of these words and concepts we've been talking about. So, excellent. Thank you very much. Next Wednesday, I will be right here in the sanctuary, 6:30. If you would join me, hope to see you there. Thank you.